You've likely heard this 1,000 times. Show don't tell, show don't tell, show don't tell, show don't tell, show don't tell. Now you've heard it 1,005 times. This is probably the most common piece of writing advice that gets dispensed. In fact, I would wager that entire grade school creative writing curriculums are based around this idea. Because this is such a common topic and a widely dispensed piece of advice, I'm going to spend the next several videos going into some different aspects of it. I'm totally doing that because of those reasons I listed, not because I tried to write it all in one script and couldn't do it without it becoming a massively long, gigantic video, so... In spite of its commonality and ubiquity, show don't tell is probably one of the most difficult pieces of advice to implement in your writing. Part of this is because the way this advice is usually framed is a little bit flawed. That's what we're mainly going to talk about today. Showing and telling are both different ways to get information across to the reader, and you should ultimately be using the right one in the right place. Telling relies on relating information through exposition. Showing relates information through sensory means that ground the reader in the scene. I've talked before about how storytelling is really just about triggering specific emotional responses in the reader. These things are triggered through sensory details and actions that are shown through the text. Showing involves implying things and letting the reader's reaction to those things fill in the dots for them. I think I meant to say connect the dots, or maybe fill in the blanks. If a character pulls their coat closed and stuffs their hands into their pockets as their cheeks are burned from the wind, we can probably infer that it's cold out. These kinds of sensory details create an image in our mind much more than just being told that it's cold out. What I just described is an example of showing. Just telling the reader that it was cold out is an example of, well, telling. Telling doesn't provide the same kind of sensory detail, and while the reader will still know what's happening, they won't have as specific an image painted in their mind. This, as we'll talk about later, isn't always a problem. Showing and telling are really about getting information out at different levels of abstraction. Information related through showing is going to be less abstracted than information related through telling. Less abstraction means more immersion. The reader will have a deeper connection to the story. Telling leads to more abstraction and therefore less immersion. The reader will instead be a few steps away from the action, and their mind will be filling in a lot more of the details because a lot of those details aren't provided. And this is kind of where I think this advice falls short in the way it's usually presented. Show don't tell tends to present this as a zero-sum situation. It seems to imply that you should always show and avoid telling at all costs. You see, telling isn't always a bad thing, and there are times where telling things to the reader is perfectly acceptable and maybe even preferable. It's more about knowing when to show and when to tell and the positives and negatives of each approach. Now, I think this is still good advice for most people, as a lot of new writers and a lot of experienced writers tend to tell way too much. That was kind of hard to say. And in general, showing usually results in better, more interesting writing. Showing, if done right, I wrote that W-R-I-T-E in my notes and didn't even notice. Showing, if done right, helps to avoid things like info dumping. It will improve your characterization and help address issues with pacing. The reader, because they will be more grounded in the story, will have an easier time following the action and a better understanding of what's going on. Because of the sensory information provided, the reader will have a much clearer image in their mind and usually a more consistent one. If I tell you that a character stepped into a house, every reader is going to have a different image of that house in their mind. Whereas if we show the character walking past the unmowed grass and stepping onto the creaky, rotting porch and struggling to open the rusted lock, then we know much more about that house, and there's a much clearer image in our minds of what that house looks like. Now, all that being said, telling does have some advantages. Probably the most important being that it is a much quicker way to get information across to the reader. You'll notice in virtually every example of show versus tell that the showy version is much longer. That's because explaining all that sensory information takes a lot of words. Now, even though showing takes more words, if it's done correctly, the reader won't necessarily notice. The increased engagement that you get from the immersion will offset the additional words. In fact, it might seem like things are actually moving faster. If you've ever read through a long info dump, which is kind of the poster child for a bad example of telling, you'll probably agree that these kinds of passages take forever to get through, whereas an engaging scene with a lot of great sensory details can move pretty quickly, even though it takes more words. But there are times where telling's leaner word count can be advantageous, where it can get you where you need to be quicker. A literal example of this is if you have characters traveling between locations where important plot moments are happening, but nothing important happens on the trip from point A to point B. In this situation, you can simply tell the reader that the characters went from point A to point B, or better still, simply imply it by having them be at point B in the next scene. There's no point in immersing the reader in the trip between those 2 points because it serves no purpose to the story. It doesn't matter that the reader is picturing the trip accurately in their mind, because it's not important to the plot. If something important and plot relevant did happen on that trip, then you would probably need to do some showing. There's other examples, and we'll probably talk about those in upcoming videos, but for right now, just understand that telling can get information to the reader in a much quicker way, and knowing when it's best to get information to the reader in that quicker way is an important skill to learn. So I guess this video was kind of about the advantages of showing and the advantages of telling, kind of. Next week we'll talk about showing versus telling and describing the setting. Then we'll spend another week talking about dialogue, and probably another week talking about action, and maybe another week talking about this in the context of world building. Today was basically just an introduction, mainly because I tried to write the introduction for this and it ended up being as long as most of my scripts usually are. Regardless of the fact that this video was basically just an introduction to a bunch more videos, I hope you found it interesting and the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can wait around until next Wednesday when I upload the next video in this series, or check out all my previously uploaded videos. And also subscribe to my channel. Forgot to say that. I post new videos every Wednesday. Said that already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Worst outro I have ever done in my entire life.